Right, how are we at? How are we at numbers wise? Super. Shall we just kick off, guys?
Yeah.
A big welcome to everyone. Welcome to live festival events, virtual festival events that we've done. My name's Gary. I'm the Visitor Experience Manager and Brand Ambassador for both Glen Scotia and Local Mint Whiskies. What I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce you to our panellists. But just to give you a quick rundown of the format for tonight, ultimately we are going to, hopefully you've all got some drams. You've got the three drams we're going to go through tonight are in order: the Victoriana, the double cask, and the 15. I think is the right order that I had.
Correct.
And we're going to, it's less of a formal tasting tonight, more of a kind of bit of a discussion. We're going to be chatting about Campbelltown, and aside, I think that many of us that know Campbelltown is quite well, don't know as well, and it's the illicit distillation side of things. And the man that's going to give us the absolute inside track on this is Angus Martin. I'd like to introduce Angus to you all. Literally, what Angus doesn't know about Campbelltown isn't worth knowing. If there is a subject about Campbelltown specifically, I can almost guarantee that Angus literally has written a book on it. How many books are we at now, Angus, from you?
Mid-30s.
Excellent. Genuinely, the encyclopedia of all things Campbelltown. And to help us get through this journey of Campbelltown, we've got Neil Ridley and Joel Harrison. And I've been spending the afternoon trying to think up the best way to describe Neil and Joel. And I think that the best way I landed was if Ant and Dec decided they were doing whiskey, they wouldn't get a look in against these two guys.
It's very kind.
That work?
It works the other way. If we ever decided to get into light entertainment on BBC TV or ITV, we wouldn't get a look in, I'm afraid. It's, yeah.
So writers, journalists, again, all things spirits. Neil and Joel, you guys have both done, let's say, some writing, some presenting. A wealth of experience.
Yeah, that's what we do. And Neil and I have been doing this now for about 12 years. We started off with a website called caskstrength.net that was aimed to bring a slightly different, more, I guess, cheeky sideways look at Scotch whisky, to sort of bring it to the masses a little bit more. And that's developed into writing books. It allowed us to go professional. We do drinks on television, and around the world, we write for different magazines and newspapers. But our true love, Gary, as you all know, is Scotch and is the history of Scotch. And we love talking about and educating people and getting educated ourselves about the history of Scotch whisky. And I think that's what's so exciting about today is we're going on as much of a journey, I think, as everybody else involved.
Super. No, and I think it's, I'm, like I said, I'm personally really, really excited about this session. It's something I know a little about, and I've picked up the odd stories here and there. But I'm really looking forward to getting into some of the detail and some of the juicy gossip. So I think without further ado, I think I'll hand over more to you guys, Neil and Joel.
Sure.
So I know you've been having a think about this. You come up with some questions, and we'll just have a conversation through it. And I'll try and keep an eye on the chat. So if anybody else in the audience has got some questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. We'll try and bring them in, and we'll just kind of try and make it as interactive as we can tonight.
Great stuff. Thanks, Gary. That sounds brilliant. Good evening to everyone, and I hope very sincerely that this is the last time we shall meet on Zoom. I hope next time, I don't mean that in a negative way, I mean it very much in a positive way, in that next year we will almost certainly be in person in a Dunwich warehouse, drinking a dram of Glen Scotia, be it Victoriana or anything else, and toasting our newfound freedom and a future of success. It's been interesting doing these tastings over Zoom, and I think that the longer we've gone into the last year, we've got a bit more adept at it now. Obviously, it's great that you've been able to get these packs out to people as well with all the whiskies. And what's been brilliant is to see the sheer number of people internationally joining us as well. And hopefully we can all be together in Campbelltown, regardless of where you're from, be it Australia or Austria or Sweden or Switzerland. It would be lovely to share a drink with you all. But today is going to be fun. I think talking about Campbelltown is something that we love doing. And I think it's a place we've loved visiting very much in the past. Joel, you may want to recount our first ever visit to Campbelltown.
I think
Not all of it. Not all of it.
Not all of it. No. Neil and I have traversed Scotland sort of far and wide. And when we were starting up in this business, there wasn't really a system in place for the invitation like there is these days of to educate more and more sort of younger writers coming through. So we had the privileged position of being self-employed in the work that we were doing. We were both record executives at different record companies, and we'd left to become consultants. And we spent a lot of our time driving up to Scotland and just driving around distilleries. And anybody who's been will know how unbelievably friendly it is as a place. You know, people are so welcoming, they're so willing to share knowledge. And we've been many times to the wonderful island of Islay with its fantastic smoky whiskey, its lovely distilleries. And I think about the third or fourth time we were in Glasgow, and we decided to drive up this huge long drive past the Rest and Be Thankful and down the Mull of Kintyre. We thought, this is ridiculous. We've done this 2 or 3 times before. Why have we never gone to Campbelltown? So we took it upon ourselves to overnight on the way, sort of have a few drams and enjoy the scenery of the Mull of Kintyre. And I remember driving down past Kennecraig, where you get the ferry over to Islay, and you keep going, and you keep going, and you keep going, and you go a little bit further, and you keep going again, and suddenly there's Campbelltown. But I tell you what, it's a lot further down that road than you think it is, past these incredible beaches, and you end up on this peninsula. And I remember standing with Neil, I think the first night we were there, up on a point at the end of the Mull of Kintyre, up by a hotel there, looking out, and you could see Northern Ireland, you could see Islay, you could see Campbelltown, and you could see mainland, the lowlands of Scotland. And I thought, very few places in the geography of Scotland can you stand somewhere and see what 1, 2, 3, 4 different whiskey regions. And that is what's so magical about the place. It really is brilliantly remote.
Yeah, no, and it's been fondly in our heart. I mean, the last time we were visiting was the event, the festival, a couple of years ago now.
The last physical festival we had.
Yeah. And it was great to recount a similar journey which Alfred Barnard did back many years ago, at which he charted in his book, The Whisky Distilleries of the United Kingdom. And I'll just read you one quick passage, actually. I always love this. It's the fact that the journey down to Campbelltown by coach usually occupies 6 hours. And I thought, that is a considerable amount of time. And he's talking about the sort of luxuriant countryside and the rocky shore and the wide ocean. And he sums it up. He says, Campbelltown is certainly a most attractive place, and we were charmed with its appearance. It is situated at the head of a beautiful bay, which is almost landlocked and girt by heath-covered hills. And it's great, even today, or 2 years ago when we came down, it was really charming to be met by that landscape and that scenery. And it's woven very much into the fabric of the whiskey making today, but also the yesteryear. And we feel really lucky and privileged to have Angus with us to take us through what it was like back then and who some of these characters were, because the world of whiskey, of course, was very different back then. It wasn't quite as we know it now. There was a lot of illicit distilling going on. Now, Angus, you've, as Gary was saying, you've written extensively about the region and about the whiskey and about some of these local characters. I mean, in a way, Campbelltown went from being probably one of the busiest places to one of the quietest as we know it now. I mean, what's 2.5, 3 distilleries running now? In a way, it's still, in my heart, the whiskiest of all places, whiskiest of all Scotch regions. What was life really like back during that sort of illicit period in the 1800s?
Well, a complex subject, of course, but basically, there was a lot of poverty here. All the farmers were tenant farmers, and illicit whiskey was, well, it was a sideline, but it was an essential sideline because it helped to pay the rent and it helped to feed families. So almost everybody was involved in it from bottom to top. And there was a lot of collusion as well, among magistrates. Certainly illicit distillers were prosecuted. And they were also, hounded by some of the lairds. Duke of Argyll, for example, he had a clause in certain of the farm leases, which was a £5 fine to be donated to the poor of the parish, and the equipment would be sold for the benefit of the informant. So there were obviously informants around.
Wow, £5 was a lot of money then, wasn't it, as well?
It was a lot of money, yeah. It would be ruinous, pretty much, yeah. But
it sounds like the sort of thing Netflix should make a movie about. I think it's one of these. You sit down and you watch all these box sets on Netflix and about stuff being moved from various parts of South America over to Europe, and you think, God, this was the illicit distilling movements of the day were a story to be told, and I think that's fascinating. But it was interesting that the fines were going to the poor of the parish, which is interesting.
Well, that was just in the case of the Duke of Argyll. He was the biggest landowner, and he was very much against illicit distilling. Some of the smaller lairds turned a blind eye. In fact, some of them were probably involved in it. But it was a cottage industry basically. And I mean, when you mentioned South America, well, I mean, there is a parallel with the drugs trade. There's no question about that.
Well, it's interesting. We were thinking about. I remember when we first met, Angus, and there were two words you mentioned: murder and intimidation. Immediately, that struck me. I thought, this sounds like the beginning of a Breaking Bad episode. And I guess illicit distillation is just what it is. It was illegal. Where was this sort of stuff happening, and what were the kind of stills like back then? What was that process like for an illicit distiller?
Well, we'll see a picture of illicit distillers operating sometime later. But well, it was happening all over. There was distilling went on in town, which was very convenient, and later in the 19th century. Occasionally, a house would be renovated, and in the foundations there would be a vault where a still would be, and the smoke would just go up into the ordinary chimney, so it was undetectable. But most of the whiskey would be made in remote places.
Sure.
But by the remoteness, it was difficult to get the equipment there. So basically, if you found a place which was usually beside a burn or a stream, obviously, sometimes a waterfall, you needed plenty of cold water to make whiskey.
Of course.
If you found a place, you would consolidate it. There's quite a number of sites have been identified, sometimes through local knowledge. Usually it's the bank of a stream which has been cut in, and a stone platform built, and that's where the equipment would be. And
right.
They would be taking the water, to cool the worm straight from the running stream. So basically, yeah, remote places, and of course the remoter the place, then the less likely that they would be apprehended by the excisemen or gadgers.
I mean, I guess there was a point where if you saw, maybe there was a warning system, or you knew that the excise man was coming, he was close. I guess you had to break everything down quickly. It was all obviously red hot, and you had to move it. Or in some cases, I guess they must have just abandoned it there, did they?
Well, they had, for the most part, they had, I would say, impeccable systems of information and transmission of information. Fires could be lit. one of the, by the signal fires, one of the children were always on the watch. Everybody was on the watch for strangers. Although some of the excisemen were actually living among them. And there would be Gaelic speakers because most of the areas where whisky was made, the population was entirely Gaelic speaking. Sometimes, well, in the village of Moosdale, the warning sign was the waistcoat would be turned inside out. So if you saw a man coming into the village with his waistcoat inside out, you knew there was trouble on the way.
That's brilliant.
Places where they could watch, like a prominent rock at the end of a glen. They could see strangers coming for literally miles away.
Wonderful.
They were always on the lookout. Yeah.
Wonderful. Gents, listen, before we go any further, I'd like to make a bold suggestion that we pour a whiskey.
Yes, absolutely. Should we dive in on the Victoriana?
Yes.
Here we go.
I had some questions about this. Now, we great that we chose this one, actually, I think, to kick off with, because if I'm right in thinking, Gary, this was one of the whiskies that was really designed to sort of hark back to, maybe not to the illicit times, but certainly the style of Campbelltown whiskey, which was being made, I guess the sort of back end of the 19th century. And there's something, as soon as you nose a glass of Glen Scotia, it does transport you back. And that's why I mentioned that word, the whiskiest place, because it is unlike no other whiskey. I mean, hands down, you could give me a flight of different whiskies, and largely speaking, it's quite hard to tell where they're from. But you put your nose into something like this, and it's Campbelltown. Angus, I'm interested in this as a sort of an idea of the landscape and the water and everything that went into making this. What was the spirit like back in the day?
Oh, that's a big question. Some of it was very good, and some of it would be absolutely terrible.
Sure.
Depending on the market. Of course, a lot of people, they just wanted to get drunk, just like nowadays. So they would take cheap firewater. But some of the whiskey was, it was distilled 3 times. I mean, there is evidence of that, even in illicit distilling.
And were they selling this not only locally, but was it ever making its way outside of the region as well?
Lots of it, yeah. Skipness, which is, on this side of Kintyre, was a great, it wasn't a port as such, but there was a harbour there, and probably most of the whiskey which left Kintyre would leave by Skipness, by boat. And there were some other small ports, including Grogport.
Appropriately named, yeah.
Appropriately, we don't know.
Could they be shipping from there?
But, no, they would, even from the west side, the whiskey would come over the peninsula, over the back of the peninsula on ponies, and even from the Western Isles, some of the nearer Western Isles, boats would land whiskey on the west side of Kintyre, and it would be transported over the hills to the east side, and then it would go to Ayrshire, Saltcoats or West Kilbride, and then on into the central Scotland markets. So and the money was big there,
Sure, that's where they were really starting to make the money.
Well, one of the things you'd said, Angus, before, and I know you touched on it, how some of the landowners maybe had clauses and things about if they caught you distilling on your land. But am I right in saying that there was actually quite a lot of the kind of the gentry, if you like, around there were indeed drinking the illicit whiskey?
Yeah.
So it was very much they would turn a blind eye, I would imagine.
Well, I've got a wee story here. I mean, I don't trust myself to remember it entirely, so it was a story it was a favourite story of Dr. MacLeod, who was a minister born in Campbellton. And it's a comment on the level of involvement of everybody from, as I said, bottom to top in the trade. An old woman appeared before him on a charge of illicit distillation. This was before Sheriff Duncan Campbell. And he seemed quite uneasy, uncomfortable, in the presence of the woman. So eventually he said, no doubt, my good woman, it's not often you have been found guilty of this crime. And she replied, no, Sheriff, I haena made a drop since yon wee keg I sent yourself. So, probably apocryphal, but the implication is that she was supplying him, and it was a bit of a spot having to sentence her for buying his own illicit whiskey.
That's
That's
brilliant.
fantastic
She may have been
story.
good at it. She might have been one of the, yeah.
That's
Amazing.
a brilliant story. And it just goes to show, doesn't it, how distilling has always been a community affair, really, in that respect. And I think despite legislation and what's needed to be shown to excisemen and the wider landowners, it's still a social lubricant. And that's where it's become so important. I mean, we've seen over the last 18 months how important things like whiskey and other drinks have become in keeping people together and keeping people entertained in a really nice way. And I think you only have to see that in a small community like Campbelltown, where what a social lubricant it was, but what a brilliant export it became. And it became absolutely vital in the world of blended Scotch, didn't it? It became such an incredible ingredient because of its texture, because of its flavour, because of its personality.
Well, I mean, getting back to the whiskey now, I think, you put your nose in there, you take your first sip, that smoke that's there, this isn't Isla smoke. This isn't that broadly iodine-y, earthy peat, is it? There's a softness to this, slightly peppery, very distinctly different. And I mean, if you go back to that time, if I'm right in thinking that Queen Victoria did visit Campbelltown, or did she ever leave the vessel that she was on, Angus? What was the...
She did a grand tour, a tour by sea of the west of Scotland in 1847.
Right.
The Royal Yacht did come into Campbellton. But it was said that because of the smell of the place, because there was all the open sewers, and also there was the effluent of all these distilleries flowing into the head of the loch. So, I mean, I remember even as a boy, there could be a
pungency, yes.
Just a smell of sewage and waste at the head of the loch. And it was even worse then because the rock, this was before the loch was reclaimed. So there was a huge ebbing expanse where all this mud and dead things and sewage gathered. So it would
for the benefit of anyone who hasn't been, it isn't like that anymore. I can assure you, it's a beautifully clean place now,
But the town crier, he went round the town. He was shouting, "The Queen is in the loch! The Queen is in the loch!" So people found that quite amusing. The ship is in the loch. And there is another connection with, another royal connection, because 1871, the Queen's artistic daughter, Princess Louise, married the Marquis of Argyll. The Marquis of Lorne, the Duke of Argyll's daughter. And they had their honeymoon up here. They took him in on a yacht. But in that same very year, the two Greenlees brothers from Campbellton launched out their business. And of course, they became, they're credited with popularising blended whiskey and also popularising whiskey worldwide. So I think they are central figures in blended whiskey. But
what to answer for those two?
It's all gone into reverse. But 1871, there was a big banquet in London to celebrate the marriage, and Greenlees brothers launched Lorne whiskey there, named after the Marquis of Lorne. And that kind of set them going. So that's another royal connection.
Interesting with this Victoriana, because I think it's big, isn't it? I mean, you've got a huge flavour with this 54.2. It doesn't really drink aggressively, though. I mean, I think as we talked about the style of whiskey, some of it will have been very aggressive. We'll talk a little bit about aging actually when we get onto our next dram shortly. But that smoky style that's there, that's very distinct for the region. I mean, would we say that that's down to local barley? Could that be down to sort of mainland peat, for instance, as well, that was being used at the time?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't be certain, if there's any, or if there are significant material links with present-day whisky and the whisky of the past.
Sure.
I mean, illicit whisky, it was made as quickly as possible. I mean, the process was the same.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think the most difficult part of the process was at the beginning, especially if they were doing their own malting, because that involved steeping the barley in, well, puddles, drying it and sprouting it, and sprouting it in caves. Everything was done in concealment, so the whole process from start to finish was bedeviled by fear of detection.
Sure.
Although some of them did get their malt from maltsters in town, paid for it and paid the due. But I mean, certainly peat would be involved in it. Maybe coal. This was a coal producing area, and wood as well. There were some illicit distillers preferred birch. They burned birch when they were distilling the whisky. They believed it imparted a distinctive flavour.
That's amazing.
Well, I mean, they would burn what they could get.
Whatever they got, yeah.
I was gonna say, Angus, it must have been difficult to go around Kintyre and almost not discover some sort of whisky distillation going on.
No, they were very well concealed. Yeah, mostly it was inland. In the glens, tops of glens. There were, as I said before, they would excavate the bank of a ravine in a stream, and they took great care to. It was very difficult to find most of these stills. But if you're looking for them now, it would still be difficult. You would be walking up the beds of dried out streams and just looking for a wee platform.
Wow.
I think what's fascinating for me is the way that Campbelltown has it boomed so heavily sort of post illicit distillation, and now it's back to being, well, a really small, almost boutique production area, and it still maintains its derogation as an approved Scotch Whisky Association area for production. But I mean, Glen Scotia itself is small, Gary, right? It's 800,000 litres capacity. That sort of thing.
We're currently producing just a little bit over 500,000. Okay, cool. And I think when you look at Campbelltown as a region, I don't think we're over 1 million litres.
I don't think it can be really, yeah. If you're at 500,000,
I mean, if you think of our sister distillery, Loch Lomond, I mean, we can do 5 million litres of malt out of that one distillery.
Yeah.
But the region of Campbelltown itself is only producing just less than 1 million. It's mad when you think.
I mean, I think that's what makes it really special, isn't it? And I think in a way, if you look at this sort of global appreciation of Scotch, which it never seems to sort of subside. You get new markets everywhere. It's what makes the region so attractive, because it's not like you can turn the tap on and make more, or suddenly build another 10 distilleries. It's a great place to visit. It is, I imagine, quite a difficult place if you were considering building another distillery there now. But in a way, the scarcity of distilleries and that closeness of distillers in a way that exists means that it probably is certainly the most desirable whisky region I can think of with that in mind. Just going quickly on one with the questions, actually. There's a great question here. Stuart Monroe was asking, do we have any idea of what level, if any, maturation happened? Or was it sold more like, as we would recognise today, as a sort of new make spirit? Now, what I would suggest we do is we dive into our second whisky, our double cask, and let's consider this a little bit more, because Angus, we were talking when we first met that time about the still running, the whisky running clear from the stills, but they obviously had to get it to and from, or rather from and to the stills to wherever they were selling it. Now, what kind of vessels would they have used back then?
Well, these casks of any kind. I don't think there would be particular. It would probably be small casks that would be made by local coopers. or they would just be recycled, you know, from anything that was being exported or used. And some of them devised the cask so that the cask itself concealed rather than simply carried the whiskey. There was one illicit distiller up in a place Balachroy up North Kintyre. He was actually, you may have heard of him, he was a fourth cousin of President Ronald Reagan. And his name was Johnny Blue. And Johnny Blue's wife, she was a McKinley, and her brother was a Cooper. And he made a cask. I think he and Johnny got their heads together and designed this cask. So the inside of the cask contained whiskey, but both ends and to a good depth at each end, it was butter. So if they were stopped by revenue officers and searched, then ostensibly they were carrying agricultural produce to market. But
Wonderful.
It was a whiskey.
That's brilliant.
That's
wow. So it was
incredible.
effectively had false walls in the cask. So if they were to look
false,
either end,
yeah,
false
false
side,
top and
wow.
bottom. That
Well,
butter.
that was really, anyway, yeah. And also skins were very popular, and bladders.
Okay.
The women, of course, as women, not only made a lot of whiskey, but they also carried it. In these days, they had voluminous skirts, and they would tie, usually it was bladders, pig's bladders maybe. After a pig was slaughtered, they kept the bladder, and they would hang these bladders under their skirt, and they were virtually undetectable. And I don't suppose an excise officer would dare lift a woman's skirt. Of course, I was hoping that.
I have to say, I think after lockdown, after 18 months of lockdown, I think I look like I'm smuggling plenty of whiskey around with me at the moment.
Plenty of bladders under your shirt. There,
exactly.
Yes.
So I hope I don't get stopped by the excise man.
Skins as well. They would use, animal skins. There was one woman. She was at one time. Even a pint of whiskey was worth a bit in Glasgow, and they used to smuggle it aboard the smacks. Ostensibly they were passengers, but they were actually carrying whiskey. And there was one woman, she had what appeared to be a baby at her breast, but it was actually a skin full of whiskey. She was cradling as though she had an infant with her. She was caught right enough, but it was
Wonderful.
It was a good tribe. Oh no, they had all sorts of dodges. And the last illicit distiller was about 1880, just north of Campbellton, which is quite late. You know, if you're reading local newspapers, it appears to disappear. As an illicit industry about 1860, but there would be some carrying it on.
Would a lot of them moved into the legal side of things, Angus? Because obviously, like you said, that they still needed to make their money to pay the rent and things.
Aye, oh yes. I mean, most of when I say most, but many and possibly most of the distilleries from 1817 onwards, when legal distilling became more profitable, and then of course later it became exceedingly profitable. The distillers started to buy, or build or buy mansions, and they had yachts and servants galore, foreign holidays. But most of them came out of the illicit side.
I mean, Gary, you're the embodiment of that now with your yachts and all your servants and so forth.
I didn't want to bring it up, but I mean, I am currently from the yacht. But I mean, it's true, Angus, isn't it, that at one point in time, Glebe Street was the most expensive street in the UK, outstripped anything from Mayfair, London, or anything else across the UK.
Never heard that.
Yeah, no, from my understanding, because of purely the number of distilleries and the bonded warehouses on Glebe Street.
Well, certainly, aye. Well,
the value in that street outstripped anything in the rest of the UK, like I said, central London or beyond.
Yeah. Oh, you mean in the actual asset
value?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Ah, it could be. That could be. Certainly, there was a lot of warehouses there. There was the Adlissa and Duncan McCallum's distillery, Glen Nevis, and Springbank was down the lane
Yeah,
from there.
you were a stone's throw from about 6 distilleries from there. That was
Yeah.
I mean,
I
what
think
you're
that's-
describing is the Monaco of Scotland here, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
It's, you know, it's,
Well, without the sunshine and the beautiful women, yeah.
And the king and the
all the
royalty.
Formula One drivers. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
I think that's the remarkable thing when you visit Campbelltown is how many of these places you drive past are former distilleries. And,
Yeah.
you know, you can read up on these, you know, Neil was reading from Barnard's book, and there's plenty of evidence of tangible evidence of the distilleries that existed. And you even have to go back and read some of the recipes for some of the blends of those sort of mid 1800s, late 1800s recipe books from some of the great blending houses. So key, so reliant on this big oily spirit that came out of Campbelltown, and really just jealously guarded, but highly sought after. And I think that's interesting when we come to taste these, because in both the Victoriana and the double cask that we've got so far, there's a real terroir, there's a real backbone to these whiskies, which is, I'm sorry to say it, but it's just purely Campbelltown. And you go to a couple of the other distilleries around Campbelltown and you get the same thing. But for me in Glen Scotia, it is the prime example of it in terms of the way that it's amplified through the whiskey and through its oiliness.
I think with this, actually, with the double cask, and we were obviously talking about the maturation or the lack of thereof maturation back in the day. But if you look at this now and you think, okay, this is matured American oak barrels and Pedro Jimenez sherry casks. So you've got these two titanic flavors that really have reinforced the style of whiskey that we know and love today. You've got all that light fruity note that comes from bourbon casks, and then this lovely, rich, thick, spicy, slightly sweet note from Pedro Jimenez sherry. I mean, I guess back in the day, a cask would have imparted whatever flavor it had. You know, I've obviously they were a bit plainer. There weren't specifically fresh casks that were being used. I guess I remember you mentioning about the use of berry casks as well in the event.
Bog casks.
Bog casks, yeah.
Bog
Tell us a bit more about those. I mean,
That was weird. I don't think I answered the original question, which would be that there was almost no, with illicit distillation, there was virtually no maturation unless it was accidental. Yeah. Because the whole idea was to make it quickly and get rid of it quickly. Because
I suppose the longer you mature it, the higher your risk of getting caught.
Oh, absolutely. From stage one right through the whole process of distillation, the illicit distiller was in danger. Yeah, they could lose just about everything, and it was desperate stuff. But there were all these, and I quite believe it that in a time of emergency, it might be, advisable if you had time to bury a cask in peat in the bog. Of course, the danger of that is you've got to remember where you buried it. And
I love that. Yeah.
If you die before you can go back to recover it, then it's gone. But
I wonder now if there must be across the peat bogs now remnants of some of those casks left. I mean, I guess they're probably all long since decayed away. But
no. Peat preserves wood. No, I've heard it said that what were said to be bits of casks were dug up while peat cutting. So there could well have been. And one old farmer told me that there was an old fellow when he was young. This was up in Barglen, a farm called Skirnish. He was convinced, he'd been told there was a barrel of whiskey on the other side of the glen, and if they could each discover where it was, it might be still quite drinkable. It was never found.
And the search goes on, I guess.
Imagine that would be worth a pretty penny if it was found now.
Well, I think it would be undrinkable. A peat bog.
I'll take that challenge.
150 years of peat bog. I don't think I would risk it.
Guys, I think there was a.
Stuart
Oh,
Monroe
sorry,
wants to
Gary.
know which farm you mentioned there. I think Stuart's possibly talking about taking a road trip.
Oh,
Stuart's got his spade ordered from Amazon, hasn't he? I think.
Skirnish Park Glen. Skirnish Park Glen. It'll be on the south side of the Glen if it exists.
Yeah, there tonight. Yeah, hang on.
Hey,
I found something.
Don't mind me. Don't mind me.
I think that's what's so amazing about those beaches just north of Campbelltown. I mean, everything's just north of Campbelltown, right? But those beaches just north of Campbelltown,
Oh no,
which feels so much like almost like you're in the Caribbean, and you could be in the Caribbean. And we had I think it was a rum cask Glen Scotia last year, which was just phenomenal. And that idea of this big oily spirit in a rum cask worked so well, and it brought so many interesting and different flavors to the whiskey itself. And actually, I think that sort of piratey element almost lends itself perfectly to the Scottish concept of pirateering and illicit distilling and illicit import and export of whiskey. So yeah, I think that was a nice little cross segment of flavors.
Speaking of which, maybe now will be a good time for us to show the image that Angus found of the illicit distillers. Now, in a way, this is like the sort of Instagram snap of its day, isn't it? Really, and it's quite incriminating in many respects. So if someone had their photo taken in possession of an illicit still, I mean, that's about as incriminating as it gets, isn't it? Angus, tell us a little bit about the scene that's going on here. Do you know who these people are?
Yeah, there's the man in the middle, that's Baldy-Rua McAllister, Red Archibald McAllister.
McAllister, you say, eh?
I wonder. There we go.
No, they're different. There's no connection to the esteemed manager here.
You say that now, but give it a bit of get him on time, team, or who do you think they are?
No, I can guarantee you, the McAllisters were travelling tinsmiths, so they may well have made and repaired stills. I don't know. That looks like a copper still, but from left to right, you have the creel of the basket. Now, presumably there would be peat in that. Then next to the basket, of course, is the still itself.
Sure.
And it's been built up. You can see the rocks there. It's been seated on rocks, and the fire is underneath. And you can see the arm there leading into the barrel there, and the worm is inside the barrel. And at the bottom of the barrel, there's what it's called in Gaelic a pedin. And that's the wee pipe where the distilled liquor comes out. I think there's a funnel there, and then there's a receptacle below that. And James McAllister, he's the one on the right, and he seems to be pouring a sample. But there's something peculiar about the photograph. Well, for a start, that's just that's a cropped photograph. There is a cottage to the right in the background, so there must be a road there, and that looks like a seawall. So I think it's in the shore, and in the bigger image, you can see a stream or a burn. Bottom right, you can just see the edge of it.
Oh yes, of course, yeah. Okay.
But basically, there's no water in that burn. So where are they getting the water? And there should be water running into the barrel there.
Yeah. There's a pipe, isn't there? So that pipe would have been leading the water out of it, or the worm tub out.
Well, I mean, somebody has interpreted that as the end of a shovel. Possibly.
Oh, I guess couldn't it? Yeah.
What it is, I don't know. But I mean, even if it is a pipe, there's no evidence that there's any cold water getting into that worm tub.
I think that's the really fascinating thing about illicit distilling, and Neil and I took a tiny little still to a beach nearby Campbelltown a couple of about 7 or 8 years ago, and we had some wash from a local distillery, and we were looking to distill it. So we lit up this tiny little Portuguese alembic still that we had.
2 litre, wasn't it?
2 litre one. And what you don't realise is quite how much water you need to cool down the worm tub and to keep the worm tub cold, because obviously as the spirit comes off the still, as it hits the line arm and comes down, it comes down as hot vapor and then latterly into kind of liquor. But that acts almost like a radiator or a filament heating up the water. So this flow through of cold water to keep that condensation coming out of the bottom end of the condensing pipe is absolutely vital. So it's it's fascinating to see that, and obviously I think most people would think there that they're just filling that barrel full of spirit, but yeah, of course it has to be condensed first, and that's
well.
What
I remember dipping my finger in actually into the to the sort of where the worm tub was, the sort of receiver, and at the top the water was red hot, and if you dipped it in a bit quicker, suddenly there was a dramatic change in temperature. Actually, the water at the bottom was still quite cold, but at the top it was obviously really red hot, and that would make sense as it came down this line on down the sort of serpent in all the way through out the end. Of course, it would have been condensing back into a liquid and wouldn't have been that hot vapor. What's fascinating here actually with that picture of the still is, as crude as it is, clearly that's been designed for purpose. And you look at that flat head on it, the vapors are hitting that quite harshly, then going down the pipe. There's no sort of, I guess the sort of hourglass shape that we know and love today. But there is that waste effect there, isn't there, Angus? And I mean, I guess they will have developed these over time. They will have known what worked quickly and efficiently.
Yeah, but I'm not very sure about capacity, but that looks like quite a big one.
Yeah.
10 gallons. Well, I don't think in litres, but 10 gallons was the average size. I heard of one in Qatar which was 18 gallons, but that was a big one.
And there is a lot of the reason we know so much about what was going on in the region, Angus, is from the local coppersmith.
Oh,
and God bless him, and the records he kept and the books he had.
Yeah,
isn't that right?
The Armour still books, yeah. They've been, in fact, the still books are back in Kintyre. There's somebody up near Carradale has them, and they're still in the Armour family. You would think they would be in an archive, but anyway, he has them for a month, and he's examining them again. But everything's in there. Who was doing it? How much how much the work cost, how much a still cost, how much repair cost, and there was even a wee bit of barter. Sometimes Armour would accept whiskey.
Nice.
Not very often. It was usually money, and the money seems to have been, in almost all cases, paid.
I remember there's a great story I remember hearing about. Was there an amnesty, wasn't there, about people giving up their illicit stills and getting money back effectively for them? But it didn't really work, did it?
Well, I never heard that. No, that's news to me.
Gary, was it you that was telling us about this? The idea with there was an amnesty with the officials, and so you take your still in and you would receive payment back, and then of course effectively what everybody went and did is just went and used the money and went back to the local coppersmith to have a new still built. Albeit a better one.
They appreciated that these guys had their stills and they were producing the whiskey to make money. So they thought, right, well we'll offer you a decent lump sum of cash to make up for that lost revenue. You give up the distillation, but the canny folk of Campbelltown and the Kintyre area were then queued out the door of Armour and Sons to then get bigger and better stills made with their cash. And I think, coming back to that image that we've got there, like you said, it looks like it's designed and fit for purpose. But again, we consider the number of stills that were scattered across the peninsula, and a lot of them would have come from this local coppersmith. And it's you build enough of these, you're going to be getting pretty good at what you do. To the point where, again, so Armour and Smith in Campbelltown is now a cafe, I believe. And when they were renovating the building, and they dug through into the cellar. They essentially came on and they found the remnants of distillation. They didn't find any of the actual equipment, but all of the setup was there. There was clearly a still in place in the basement. So he was practicing what he preached as well.
Well, I suppose he had to have something he had to have a test one, didn't he, really? And whether you could argue that with the authorities if they turn the place over. Well, I've got to have one to know what I'm doing. But then, of course, you've incriminated yourself massively, haven't you, there? So how funny. Should we try our third whiskey, the 15-year-old?
Yes, that's a very good show.
Yeah.
I think we should.
Let's go on to this. Now, again, as Joel said right at the very start of this, there's that lineage of aroma and flavour that you get with Glen Scotia, and it actually exists very much in the new make as well. So if you've had a chance to visit the distillery in the past, if you've been to the Campbelltown Festival, or if you've been on holiday and you visited, chances are you will have had an opportunity to try that new make spirit, and it is inherently there. There's that smokiness, that sweetness, a fruitiness, which I find very distinct. And actually, now we've gone through a Victoriana, which harks back a little bit more to the whiskies of the yesteryear, through to our double cask, that Pedro Jimenez sherry and the bourbon cask style, giving that richness and sweetness at the same time. With this 15, you've still got that lineage there of spirit character. And I think that is probably the most profound 100%. Thing that makes Glen Scotia, I think, one of the most important distilleries in Scotland, because what you have is you can put this in anything. And like Angus, as you were saying, back in the day, you could mature whiskey, or you could carry whiskey in any sort of vessel and it would impart some flavour. But the character of the spirit is here today, no matter what you do with it, be it a rum cask or a port, or with this one. Gary, take us through the makeup of this 15. What's the cask style with this?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think one of the things to say beforehand in terms of, and you summed it up very, very well there, Neil. I think the core of what we do at Glen Scotia is about retaining that Campbelltown essence. And everything we do is very specifically to try and tie into that. So when it comes to cask selections, it's about using casks that would have been available through that trade coming through the port. And really staying true to that style, for sure. So in terms of cask makeup for the 15, so it's a mixture of, so the vast majority is bourbon. So we're looking at first fill bourbon and some refill American oak. That's pretty much there in there for the almost the full 15 years. But there's a very short, sharp finish in this of probably, I would say, a maximum of 6 weeks in Oloroso. That just gives you a wonderful, nice, dry note on the finish. This, I'm unashamedly, and I'm more than happy to say that this is 100% my absolute favourite dram out of the range, because it's Campbelltown in a glass, and it's got everything that I love about the Campbelltown region in spades. Yeah,
I mean, it's all there, isn't it? And I think you're right with that balance of flavors. You've got that honey note there. You've got the age, I think, is interesting here, because it's had an impact on the sort of the volatility of that new make spirit. The character's there. It's perhaps less apparent. You've still got that smoke there. But if you haven't already finished, or if you've got some more, pour yourself another glass of all of these. And let's go back through, actually. Let's re-nose our Victoriana. Now, that's a younger whiskey. I mean, there's no age statement on it, but clearly there's a younger style apparent here, isn't there? And smoke's there.
And that's the thing. But I mean, as much as a no age statement, Neil, as we said at the very start, it's specifically trying to recreate that modern interpretation of the Victorian style whiskey.
The style, absolutely.
But in terms of average age, we're maybe about 12.
Okay,
but
so
there is some older
spirit
in there up to 18. No, that's the thing. It's not a. Yeah,
it's not 3 years old, is it, in a day? But I mean, I think that's the beauty of it. It's the age integration is there, but then we're going into sort of the cask styles coming through a little bit more in the double cask, and you stick your nose back in there, and it's I mean, you've got that similarity, you've got that sort of peppery note, that little bit of spice, the smoke. But then the casks, I think, are probably delivering a bit more with this one. You've got that, you can almost see, cut it down the middle, you can probably
100%.
see where the Oloroso, where the Pedro Jimenez comes in and where the bourbon cask does, especially on the palate, I've noticed. But then you get into this, and suddenly this 15-year-old, it's a different beast altogether, isn't it? It's the smoke is drier, it's a little bit more aromatic. The Oloroso, I mean, in terms of Oloroso, the casks, I think the sizes they're all butts, aren't they? So they're a bit bigger as vessels, and you've got hogsheads there, I'm presuming. So that style of cask is going to start impacting the type of maturation. The bigger the cask, the longer it will take to start drawing out some of those flavors. This is just about as perfect as you can get, I think, for me as a Campbelltown expression. It's magnificent.
Yeah,
I think one of the things I love. Sorry, on you go, Joe.
No, I was going to say, for me too, I think it's that. I think Neil really hit the nail on the head when he said this is such an important distillery in the canon of Scotch whisky, and I think you can't go through any tasting of Scotch whisky without talking about Campbelltown, and particularly about Glen Scotia, because what this brings to the understanding of the flavors, the kind of kaleidoscope of flavors that come from distillation, which is hugely important over cask maturation, is that you can get oiliness, and you can get boldness, and you can get huge amount of flavor into your spirit, which you can then work within cask. And I think, these days we see a lot of whiskies that rely on cask rather than on spirit. And this does that brilliantly. It really draws on the flavour that is so distinctly Campbelltown, that big oiliness and that big flavourness that comes through, a big roundness of flavour.
I've just added a bit of water actually to these, and the difference again, actually. The evolution you find with these whiskies is amazing. With the 15, just a little tiny bit of water brings out the smokiness quite profoundly, actually. I mean, the smoke suddenly becomes much more apparent. If you go and do that with a double cask, the fruitiness. So again, you've got that split coming through, maybe a little bit more of the bourbon cask style aroma coming through. I think it's interesting, and there's a good question to ask both of you on this one. Gary, in terms of the style of whiskey that you make at Glen Scotia, obviously in the future you can experiment, depending on what type of cask you get. Will we see more evolution with different styles of, I guess more port, rum, but then other things from further afield as well, do we think?
Yes.
I don't want to put you on the spot too much there. But,
No. I don't think we'll never stand still. I don't think we ever stand still in Scotch. And we always need to be aware of current trends, things are developing, and how they change. But kind of coming back to one of my previous points, I think we will always stay very true to Campbelltown style and try and keep that historic element alive. And I don't think you'll ever see us. I feel pretty comfortable saying I don't think you'll ever see like a tequila finished or a mezcal finished Glen Scotia. There's plenty for us to explore. I mean, obviously with the this year's festival edition bottling been finished in a Bordeaux wine cask. Mm-hmm. So you'll have had wines coming across Europe or across the New World. Rums, I mean, even the depth within rum, which we touched again on the previous festival edition of the rum finish. But from that, we used a Guyanan rum. And that was a wonderful experience for me. Obviously kind of going out and doing tasting, but I had an afternoon where I sat with Michael and we tried different rums from different regions. And when you actually take the time to sit down and appreciate them and taste rums neat as we would whiskey, you really pick out these differences. Sure. And again, it's about selecting those casks that work with the Campbelltown and the Glen Scotia flavour profile. And finishing the black art that it is all about striking that balance. We never want anything to really come in and overpower our spirit. Yeah, it's about what works with it. what brings out the flavours that work really well with the spirit and complement what's already there without losing that core Campbelltown style.
No, absolutely.
So the short answer of that is yes, we will keep pushing the boundaries, but we will only go so far.
Good. Now, I think that makes a lot of sense, Gary. And I think as you've got such distinct character there, it would be sacrilegious to smother that in the sake of a cask finish. I think is the essence of that. Angus, I've got a quick question for you. In terms of, if you think of the region now, of how different it is, and actually it's a good question. This from Callum Renton, actually, who is one of the attendees. In terms of the hurt, in a way, we've got so few distilleries in the region now. What do you think the hurdles are preventing kind of new distilleries being built? I guess we've had this massive resurgence of Scotch distilleries opening up across the Central Belt. We've obviously seen a whole load of either new ones or planning at the planning stage on Islay, to the point where if you consider Islay as a small island, it's really reaching saturation. What in a way, looking at Campbelltown, what do you think those hurdles are as to why we've not seen this so much in the region?
That's a big question. I think there's I'll not call it a problem, but the distilleries in Campbell have always, with two exceptions, been in the town.
Right.
So there isn't the same scenic appeal. Certainly people come here for the whiskey, but Islay is a scenic island, and most of the other areas where distilleries are, the distilleries themselves are maybe architectural attractions. Certainly, in Islay, you could probably spend a week just going from distillery to distillery to distillery. So these distilleries, I think, will be based on tourism, whiskey tourism, interpretation centres and so on. Certainly Campbell, it could be done in Campbellton. But, it's the finance would be difficult, because you have to wait,
I think
6 years or so before you
get a long time,
At the crux of it, you're never really passing through Campbelltown.
No, it's a destination, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and don't get me wrong, it is a destination that is 100% worth coming to.
Absolutely.
And it's the scenery, the whiskey, the golf. If you're a golfer, there's a couple of fantastic courses, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful place to be. I think the people of Campbelltown are what make it for me. But it's not somewhere you end up by accident. And I think that's you epitomise it from the fact that if I was to leave the house now, I'd be in Campbelltown in 4 hours. From Glasgow. You rewind to when we're talking about the absolute heyday. Yes, that's very true, Mr. Renton. You do never pass through Ireland.
You never pass through either.
When you look at in the Victorian times and the heyday of Campbelltown, again, one of the boom reasons was that transport link. So for if you're based in Glasgow and you're trying to get to a Highland distillery, say for example back then, the state of the tracks and the roads, you could have been looking at a 2-day trip by coach and it there and back.
Yeah,
but essentially with the invention of the
lines came in. Once
that's very true, Angus. But the naval steam engine, you could do Campbelltown to Glasgow in I think about 3 hours. I think there was a couple of them that managed to go sub 3 hours, which back then was just wonderful. So that you had that direct link from those distilleries into Glasgow to get that whiskey there and beyond.
I think the other big factor is when you look at Neil read from Barnard's book earlier on, and when Barnard wrote his seminal book about whiskey distilleries of the United Kingdom, that included all of what is now the Republic of Ireland as well. And you think about the distilling region that was, as far east as sort of the highlands of of Tyne and that area of Scotland, all the way down to the west coast of Scotland and beyond into Ireland, Bushmills and down into Southern Ireland there. Campbelltown was in the centre of that, right? Where once Ireland became kind of annexed, Campbelltown became on the outskirts, whereas at one point it was in the centre of it all. And I think that's fascinating, where it was surrounded by distilling expertise. It was surrounded by barley. It was surrounded by casks coming and going and being filled and unfilled. And I heard actually, I was reading up about how the Isle of Man used to be a bit of a haven for illicit distilling. So for maturation of illicit distillation anyway. So in Ireland and in Scotland and down into sort of some of the Lake District and other places where distilling was happening, casks would be filled. After maturation was realised, they would be need to be stored somewhere. And the Isle of Man has always maintained its independence, as I'm sure Ralphie will tell everybody. But it's, whiskey was shipped out there and stored out there, and then was brought in like a kind of battleship of booze into both Ireland and mainland UK for sale and consumption, which I always thought was quite interesting. So Campbelltown was always at the heart of that, which is why geographically it was so important.
I mean, it's funny, isn't it, when we think, I mean, how many was it? It was nearly 40 odd 50 distilleries, wasn't there, in its heyday? And
yeah, so I think there was a total of about 36 over the piece. Sorry, 33 with only 26 operating at any one time.
Well, I think,
but consider the fact that a town of 9,000 people at its peak.
I mean, it's amazing. I mean, that's an enormous industry, isn't it? That was there, and in a way,
you think of the subsidiaries that go with it.
I mean, I don't want to sound sort of slightly sort of negative about this, but in a way, I'm pleased that we don't have the sort of resurgence that we're seeing everywhere else now, because I think in a way, it's about protecting, I think, the link to the past, which you've managed to do really considerably in the region. And I think this is what really does make the essence of Campbelltown whiskey so special and so sought after. And at the moment, I think so ridiculously underrated. I mean, pre-pandemic, we used to travel around the world a lot, and we do talks, and you people talking about Islay or Speyside, and your big 5 or 6 distilleries that everybody knew about. But then you introduce them to Campbelltown, and suddenly there's a look of, this is different. There's a funkiness to this. I need to know more about why this tastes the way it did. And that's the power that the region has, because it's so unique. It isn't going to be to everyone's taste, but that's the beauty of it. And I kind of don't want that to be diluted by having more distilleries in it. I know it's sad, and maybe it could support more, but at the same time, it is what makes it special.
Yes. Yeah.
No, 100%. And I think it's one of these things where when you put it within the context, and regionality is possibly becoming, people seem to think it's becoming less relevant. And I think part of that's driven by, you look at the fact that there's three distilleries in Campbelltown, they're all independently owned. Mm-hmm. So none of the big boys have got a Campbelltown distillery, so it doesn't benefit them from talking about it.
Yes.
Yeah.
So they stop talking about it. You've then got, I mean, if you take the two examples of Speyside and Highland in terms of the density of distilleries in those two regions,
sure,
there are now so many distilleries that that each individual or a new distillery that pops up needs to do something different to really stand apart. You couldn't just open a distillery in Speyside and say, I'm going to make Speyside whiskey. So what?
Well, I mean,
everybody else is doing that. You need to find something that sets you apart. But I think Campbelltown, having the three, we've still got that luxury.
I think look at it from this perspective, and I say this fondly as, first and foremost, as a whiskey enthusiast. And I've been doing this for pretty 15 years. I've been a whiskey enthusiast for a lot longer than that, probably nearly 25 years. Campbelltown is ours. There is something where it's for the whiskey enthusiast, and it really is that one place that when you visit, you still feel that connection. And I love going to Islay. I love going to the Feshila, and I've, many years, 10, 12 years I've been doing that. The more it becomes busier, the less likely you're going to have that kind of true experience. And I think I had this the first time we came over, Gary, that, you know, that for the festival 2 years ago. And there was plenty of people coming in, but you could go around and you could meet almost everybody and shake their hands. And we did a warehouse tasting with Ian and a couple of other things on the beach and all this sort of stuff. And you go away with a new set of friends. And that is the romance of whiskey. And I think long may that continue, and long may that not be watered down. You know, you can add a bit of water to your whiskey, but let's not let the Campbelltown region be watered down, I think.
Yeah, amen, Neil. Amen. I think that's a great comment, and I would heartily support that. And I think it's you see now quite how many distilleries are going to be on Islay by the end of 2022.
Yeah,
I mean, the island is at risk of sinking for distilleries, I think, at the moment. You know, it's getting to that point, and great for the economy in an almost negative way, because there's almost negative unemployment there now.
Well, I think there's more jobs than people, isn't there now? So.
Yeah, so it's one of those things where Campbelltown is just that little bit of an idyll in that world, and I think I agree with Neil. I think let's keep it special. You know?
Well, let's hope that next time round, when we sit down with our 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 drams, hopefully as many as we can, we sit down and we toast the fact that it is the most exclusive place in whiskey,
yes,
but yet the most, maybe not physically accessible, but, you know, hand on heart again, from an emotional perspective, it's such an accessible place. And Gary, you mentioned this, the people, the place, the personalities that go hand in hand with this. It's all that makes Campbelltown special. And you know, I want to throw in Angus yourself there as well. Thank you so much for your wisdom. It has been phenomenal to hear how this region has come together in the way it has. And you know, it's important to protect some of these traditions, but remember how the industry went from something so illicit to being so successful to being something very exclusive again. Have we had any more comments I'd love to get some more comments on the drams, actually. If there's anyone has any comments on their favorite from tonight, or if there's another Glen Scotia that they've had which was outstanding for them in the past, let us know. It'd be great to hear that.
Yeah, I'm going back through them, and that 15-year-old that I say finished on, I've not finished any 3 of them. I'm just really enjoying all of them. That 15-year-old is, and I've added a touch of water and just brought it down maybe but to about 30% ABV. Suddenly I'm getting all this incredible orange pith notes when you kind of express the oils from an orange, and it becomes really zesty, but in an oily, fruity manner. I mean, that is just absolutely cracking. And Victoriana's been a favourite of mine for a long time. And it's what I love about any Glen Scotia is that part of your whiskey cabinet, you can take them out and really confound people who think they know about Scotch. You know,
yeah, very much.
I know Islay, and I know the heathery Highlands, and I know sherry casks. And you're like, have you tried this big oily note that you would get from Campbelltown? And I think that's one of the fun things about it. It's the wild card. It's the joker in the pack, and that's one of the reasons I love it.
Gary, I've got a question about Victoriana, actually. I have a full bottle here, luckily, and that was very, very generous of you to send it. I actually have a bottle in my cabinet, which I bought, it must have been a couple of years ago now. And it was my first real introduction to Glen Scotia. And what an introduction. But in terms of, is this a batch-based process? Will there be any variances between the bottles, or?
Yes. So Victoriana's always been made in batches. And I think one thing I'll very quickly say before we move off the 15, there seems to be a lot of love in the chat for the 15, and I love you all for that. My hat goes off to you all. Yes, so Victoriana's always been made in a batch process, and it's been on a bit of a journey for us since we launched it. So essentially through the very first iteration of it came out at 51.5. Right. We then released our first numbered batch, and we thought, listen, we're batch processing this. Why don't we number the batch, and we'll just make it the highest ABV we can every time we do it.
Right. Solid
rationale to that. So batch 001 came out, 54.8. Out it went. We didn't quite at the time internally really think about what that entailed. because at the time we were quite a, in terms of the takeover, we were quite a young company, and we hadn't really, we'd expanded quite quickly into a lot of markets, and we didn't really think about tracking that batch, or indeed the regulations involved in terms of number of countries that need maybe like some America, South Africa, that need you to update and get approval from government bodies every time you change an ABV or something like that. So that really threw us through a loop. And what we then decided to do is we still batch process it, but we looked at how can we make, what is the highest ABV that we can take this to on a consistent basis.
Oh, I see.
And that's
Okay,
where we ended at 54. That's where we ended at 54.2. What I would hope, and we're looking at kind of how we can update, and we're always looking at how we can better the range and bring a better experience for the consumers. And I would really, really hope that we do move back to a batch numbering process. Like I said, but we make it in batches anyway. We just need to find a way to make that work for us. I think it adds a lot. That change in ABV and be able to have there's almost a collectability in having that very distinct comparison between, what did you think of batch 1 versus batch 2?
Well, I've seen this with a few other, I mean, with Tamdu or with Abelara Buna, you have these different batches. And I think what's great is when there's a significant number of bottlings there, 3 or 4 different batches, and you can go back and do a sort of side by side on these. That's when suddenly you start to realise the real differences. And actually it puts whiskey into the context that this is a living, breathing product. This isn't something that you turn a tap on and it comes out the same, albeit like a gin. With Scotch, it really is dependent on cask types. And, those cask types, largely speaking, might remain the same. But the casks within those cask types, even though they're sitting next to each other in the same warehouse, you could draw a sample out of each one and the whiskey's different. That is just the majesty of whiskey. Quick question, actually,
100%.
For Angus here, actually, from Ian Clevedon. What if you could estimate the sort of number of the highest number of illicit distilleries at its peak, Angus? Is there any sort of stats that you might be able to allude to here?
Well, I probably have some somewhere here, but I mean, it would be in the hundreds.
Okay.
A lot of the operators, they were consortia. There could be, half a dozen or so. Some were men, some were mixed sexes. There were some solo operators, but no, the Armour books show that they were all over Kintyre.
Cool.
And a lot. And
one of the things you mentioned, Angus, earlier on was that a lot of the illicit distillers would have been women at the time.
Oh, yeah.
Is that right?
Well, some would be operating independently, but others were in groups, and there would be many who were doing the work of distilling while their husbands were tending to the farm. There would also be maybe widows or elderly women who would be cotters or cottagers on farms, and they would do the distilling for the tenant farmer. And of course, they would also take the rap if there were any consequences. So, no, there would be, I mean, it would help them pay their modest rent and pin money, yep. But no, there was a high number of women involved in illicit distilling. Many of them are known by name to us, yeah.
Gary, we've got a question about the production of the spirit and how does it end up with this brilliantly oily character, which I think the key word there really for me is just character. When we visited the distillery, you can see it in the small stills and the production, but you can almost smell it in the air. The only way I can describe it is it's one of the few distilleries in Scotland where I genuinely feel there's a terroir, and not a terroir from the place in terms of the region, but a terroir from the actual distillery itself. Where do you think that comes from? How is that flavour driven in?
So I suppose there's a few elements there. In terms of that oiliness, a lot of that comes from the shape of the still itself. So as much as we've got the kind of classic onion, swan neck pot still, it's quite a short but quite a squat fat base to it. and that shape really kind of helps intensify and bring those oils through into that new make spirit. One of the other things that I love about the new make that comes off Glen Scotia for me is that that slight air of that sea salt that runs through everything we do, for me, comes off in the new make spirit, and it's one of the few questions for me in whiskey that haven't scientifically been absolutely pinned down in terms of where does that salt come from. Because there are a good kind of few half dozen whiskies where that sea salt is very prevalent throughout, but nobody's been able to absolutely scientifically say, oh, it is X or Y. But for me, the atmospheric element, I mean, we're surrounded on three sides by the sea, and the sea spray is very, very prevalent. But the fact that it comes off in the new make spirit, for me, says that it's in that atmosphere.
You know, it's interesting.
It starts off there in the new make.
Gary, what you're saying about that, another, I won't mention who it is, but another well-known distillery into the idea of promoting terroir, did an experiment, I believe, where they sent a cask of whiskey off to a scientist in, I think it was in Sweden, and there was another one maturing side by side in a Danish warehouse right on the coast, and they measured the levels of saline or sodium in the whiskey over a period of time, and actually I think they conclusively proved that the one maturing by the sea had a more significant amount. And actually I think you can honestly taste that, can't you? I think it's definitely there. I think it's probably 100%. Magnified by that process, that production process. It's a combination of things. Like any great meal, it's a combination of great ingredients, isn't it? And I think that's again, the beauty of whiskey. It's a little bit of magic, you know? It's a bit of magic that the chef brings at the same time. So the wonderful dunnage, like with the open windows, the no windows, just the bars that are letting that sea air come through, and 100% they're having an effect on those casks. And I think that really intensifies it and really develops it through in the casks. Yeah. But like I said, the fact that you get that, I mean, personally, I pick it up from the new make. Says to me that it definitely starts in the atmosphere for sure.
A quick question that's coming through for Angus, which is, have you found any really interesting old bottles of Campbelltown whiskey around? Have you managed to try anything that might have been a little bit maybe illicitly distilled, maybe just distilled in a different age to today's? Or
no, there was some. There was some white spirit. In fact, Ian, the manager, had it analysed. It was found. Was it Dallaroon Distilling? Lochhead. It was a woman in town who had the house, which was formerly occupied by the manager of Lochhead Distillery. She found in a cupboard a bottle of this white spirit, the first shot, and it certainly smelled like whiskey. Well, this was a couple of years ago, so that whiskey would be 100 or 100 plus. Wow. I didn't actually get to taste it, but Ian, I think, had a sip, and he took some samples, and the woman got the bottle back. But that's the closest I've come to, an old. I think probably it was for medicinal purposes. You used to take it home, and even for toddy and so on.
Even things like that still exist to today of phenomenal snapshots and handshakes to the past. And I think that's what's so incredible about whiskey. And, it has to be matured. It has to rest. It could only be drunk when it's been made in the past. It can only be drunk in the future. And I think without a shadow of a doubt, the Glen Scotias that we've tried tonight are a genuine echo of the past into the future. And I think that's such a lovely thing about them as whiskies.
No, I think you're absolutely right, John.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, I just love that. And I think one of my favourite things about tonight is just that the stories that come through Campbelltown. and it just, I don't think I've ever gone to the town and not come away with a new one. And whether, I mean, I take many of them with a pinch of the proverbial salt, but I think it adds a lot to it. And I mean, one of my favourite ones that I know for certain is true is that obviously with the rise of illicit distilling, and as Angus touched on earlier on, there was a specific hatred of the Googles of the excise men, and everybody worked together to kind of keep them out and work against them as much as they could. But effectively, if you were an excise man and you died in Campbelltown, you were not allowed to be buried in Campbelltown.
Wow.
There is a specific graveyard. Is that not true, Angus, that one? Oh, I love that one.
Oh, that's mythology. I mean, there is what they call the English graveyard, which is...
That's the one.
Well, it's an Episcopalian graveyard. But no, there are lots of excise buried. And their children.
We'll edit Angus's bit out from there. I want to keep that one.
No, I think that would be a slur on the people of Campbellton.
God forbid either Joel or I.
They were never so bitter.
Hashtag fake news. That's fine.
Yeah. Essentially, the story went that the excisemen were not allowed to be buried in Campbelltown. They were all buried in the English graveyard outside of Campbelltown.
I was going to say,
outside of the city limits.
We had the pass away in Campbelltown, and we have to be buried somewhere nearby. I think that would be being true-blooded Englishmen. I know you're Norwegian actually.
So I'll be back to take over the place.
Depends on what you travel on. Yeah, it's your English one, Joel. That's brilliant. I think we're pretty much coming to a close, aren't we now? I think
so. Just to say that despite that story of Gary's, I've never felt more welcome anywhere in my life than in Campbelltown. So it's it's one of those places where you go, you relax, you meet people, you make friends. Because I think, as Gary said, it's a destination. You don't pass through Campbelltown. It's one of those places that you go to it with a purpose. And because of that, it blesses you. When you get there, it blesses you with its spirit. It blesses you with its whiskey. And what such a lovely blessing that is. And this has been a real blessing today.
Well, you might say that Campbellton passes through you.
Yes.
Very, very good.
That's deep, Angus.
That is deep.
No, it's not that deep.
I was going to say, it certainly will be later on. Yes. So,
yeah. Brilliant.
Guys, thank you so much. And again, Angus, thank you so much for your profound wisdom and time on this. It's been a learning curve, as it always is with anything that's great with whiskey. You always want a school day, and today's been a really great school day. Gary, thank you so much. Thanks for 3 terrifically different whiskies, but yet with that thread of Glen Scotia running all the way through them. And thank you to everybody else who's attended, and some great questions. And as I said at the very start of this, may this be the last time we meet virtually, but an introduction to the time that we all get to meet physically again. And I'm really looking forward to next year's Campbelltown Whisky Festival, because I think it will be one of those really, truly special moments where we've talked a lot in the last sort of hour and a half about what makes the region special. But to breathe that in and drink it in and meet and shake hands and hug people who actually live there and spend their days there is a really great experience. So I'm really looking forward to getting back to doing that again. So cheers, everyone. I hope you enjoyed today's session. It was great. Really good fun.
Cheers. Thank you very much.
Splendid.
Thank you, everyone. Gentlemen, thank you so much. I think just to reiterate what Neil said, Angus, thank you so much for your time. You're a true gentleman, a Campbelltown legend, sir. And thank you for letting us pick your brain and regaling us with your stories, killing some of my favourite stories.
There's lots more, but never mind.
We shall head to the Ardshiel Hotel, Angus, and we'll hit the bar at some point. You can regale us with a few more. We're buying, so.
Before you know it, there'll have been a legendary distiller called Gary Mills who would have made the best whiskey in Campbelltown.
There's still time, Gary. There's still time.
There's still time.
mean, it's the finance that's the problem, as Angus said, and that's probably more to do with me having 3 kids than anything else.
Well, I think I've heard them.
I was hoping that wasn't mine in the background, actually. I've been scratching around the door, so. Oh, dear. Anyway.
Great stuff. All right.
Very good.
All right.
Brilliant
Thank you,
stuff,
everyone.
gents.
Pleasure, man.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks
Take
everyone
care.
watching. Thanks, ladies and gents.
And thank
Lovely.
you all.
Lovely. Take care. Bye-bye.